The New York City skyline glittered like a carpet of scattered diamonds, a breathtaking panorama viewed from the rooftop bar of one of Manhattan's most exclusive hotels. Here, 30 stories above the bustling streets, the air was thin and expensive. The clinking of champagne flutes provided a constant, delicate percussion to a symphony of forced laughter and superficial conversations. It was a world of polished surfaces and transactional relationships, where power was the only currency that truly mattered. Men in tailored suits and women in designer dresses moved through the space like chess pieces on a marble board, their smiles meticulously crafted and their eyes constantly calculating. The opulence was overwhelming, a visual feast of modern luxury, yet it did little to mask the profound emotional emptiness that hung in the air, as cold and clear as the night itself. At the center of the most boisterous group sat Julian Caldwell. At 38, he was the CEO of a tech firm that had reshaped an entire industry, and he wore his success like a custom-made suit. An absurdly expensive watch peeked from his cuff as he gestured, his posture radiating an unshakable, almost arrogant confidence. He was a master of this universe, a man accustomed to conquest in both the boardroom and his personal life. But a closer look revealed a deep-seated boredom in his eyes, the weary gaze of someone who saw the world not as a place of wonder, but as a series of obstacles to overcome and people to manage. He listened to the jests of his associates with a detached amusement, a king observing the antics of his court, rich in every conceivable possession but starving for something real. The conversation turned, as it often did, to Julian's seemingly limitless ability to acquire whatever he desired. One of his associates, a man named Marcus with a slick smile, leaned in and raised his glass. "You can get anything, Julian, anything you set your sights on," he slurred slightly, a hint of envy in his tone. "Except, perhaps, something that money can't actually buy." The comment landed like a stone in a still pond, a direct challenge to the very foundation of Julian's identity. His smile tightened. His gaze, now sharp and predatory, swept across the bar, searching for a target to disprove the assertion. It settled on a young woman in a quiet corner, away from the noise. She was tuning her violin, her long brown hair falling over her shoulders, her intense green eyes focused solely on her instrument, an island of authenticity in a sea of artifice. Without shifting his gaze from her, Julian's voice cut through the ambient chatter, low and determined. "I'll bet you all," he declared, a smirk playing on his lips. "In 1 month, I will have that woman hopelessly in love with me." A wave of murmurs and chuckles rippled through his circle. The bet was a thrilling new game, a perfect distraction for a group of men who had everything and felt nothing. Glasses were raised in a collective toast, the sound of crystal on crystal sealing the cruel pact. Across the room, Clara, the violinist, remained completely unaware. She had just become the prize in a heartless wager, her genuine spirit targeted as the ultimate trophy for a man who believed love, like everything else in his life, was a commodity to be conquered and owned. Julian's first move was a study in practiced confidence. He waited for a brief pause between her songs, then approached her corner with a disarming smile he had perfected over years of strategic negotiations. He leaned against a nearby pillar, a casual posture that belied the calculated nature of his approach. "I've never heard a violin sound quite like that in a place like this," he began, his voice a low, smooth baritone designed to command attention. "It's like finding a diamond in a pile of glass." He anticipated the flicker of surprise, the flattered blush he had seen so many times before. He was offering her a glimpse into his world of luxury and power, a standard opening gambit that had never failed him. He was Julian Caldwell, and his interest was a commodity people were usually desperate to acquire. Clara, however, did not react according to his script. She looked up from her instrument, her green eyes holding his for a moment longer than was comfortable, searching for something behind the polished facade. There was no blush, no flutter of excitement. Instead, her expression was one of polite, almost clinical curiosity. "Thank you," she said, her voice clear and steady, devoid of the awe he expected. "The acoustics are challenging, but I make it work." She offered a small, professional smile before turning her attention back to the sheet music on her stand, a subtle but unmistakable dismissal. The conversation, which he had intended to control completely, was over before it had even begun. For the first time in a very long time, Julian felt like he was not the most important person in the room. He was momentarily stunned, but recovered quickly, his competitive instincts kicking in. The game had just become more interesting. He decided to abandon flattery for a more direct approach, feigning an intellectual curiosity. "You must be from Juilliard," he stated, less a question and more a demonstration of his worldliness. "I can hear the training." He pressed on, asking about the composer, the history of her violin, a series of questions designed to showcase his supposed refinement. Clara answered each one with a simple, unadorned honesty that made his own insincerity feel heavy and crude. She spoke of her music with a pure, unself-conscious passion that he found both baffling and intensely magnetic. It was like listening to a language he had never heard, but somehow understood. It's hard to describe the feeling when you realize someone's truth makes your own life feel like a lie. And if you've ever felt that way, subscribing helps us share more stories about these moments of clarity. What Julian couldn't see was the world that existed for Clara beyond that rooftop bar. Her life was not a glamorous pursuit of artistic perfection. It was a daily battle, fought with quiet tenacity. She lived in a cramped, fourth-floor walk-up apartment in a less fashionable part of the city, the rent paid for by these very gigs. The small space was filled not with designer furniture, but with stacks of sheet music, half-finished compositions, and photographs of a smiling teenage girl, her younger sister, who was fighting a relentless illness in a hospital upstate. Every dollar Clara earned playing for people who wouldn't remember her name the next day went toward medical bills and the hope of a better future. Her elegance wasn't a product of wealth. It was a shield forged in the fires of responsibility and a deep, unwavering love. Days turned into a week, and Julian found himself inexplicably drawn back to the bar, not to execute a strategy, but simply to listen. He would sit in a dark corner, nursing a single drink for hours, watching her play. He started to notice the small things, the way she would gently touch the scroll of her violin before a difficult passage, the subtle shift in her posture when the melody turned melancholic, the look of pure, unadulterated joy on her face when she lost herself completely in the music. He was no longer observing a target. He was witnessing an act of creation, a raw and beautiful expression of a soul laid bare. The bet, the boisterous laughter of his friends, the entire world of acquisitions and conquests, all of it began to feel distant and remarkably insignificant. He learned her schedule and began to arrange his own around it. One evening, he waited until she had packed her instrument away, a silent observer, until the last of the patrons had drifted off. He approached her, not with a clever line, but with a simple, honest question. "Why do you play here?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. Clara paused, surprised by his presence and the sincerity in his tone. "Because music is for everyone," she answered, looking at him directly. Even for people who might not be listening. In that moment, Julian felt a profound sense of shame. He had been one of those people. He realized he didn't want to win a bet. He wanted to be someone worthy of listening to her music. Their conversation started to fill the quiet hours after her performances. They talked about everything and nothing, walking along the edge of the Hudson River as the city lights blurred into watercolor streaks on the dark water. He found himself confessing his own sense of emptiness, the feeling of being a spectator in his own life despite all his success. She, in turn, spoke of her sister's courage, of her dream to one day play in a hall where people came only to listen. He was completely disarmed by her lack of judgment. She didn't see him as a CEO or a millionaire. She saw the lonely man beneath the tailored suit. For the first time, he felt seen not for what he had, but for who he was. Meanwhile, the architects of the bet grew restless. Marcus would call him, his voice slick with insinuation. "So, have you sealed the deal? The clock is ticking, Julian." His friend's taunts, once a source of amusement, now felt like gravel in his gut. They would send him pictures of Clara at the bar, captioned with crude jokes about his conquest. Each message was a poisoned dart, reminding him of the lie that sat at the heart of the most real thing he had ever experienced. The bet was a ghost haunting him, a constant threat to the fragile, beautiful world he was building with Clara. That moment, when you realize your old life is actively trying to poison your new one, is a powerful turning point. Subscribing to our channel is a great way to support us as we continue to explore these journeys of transformation. He began to lie to his friends, making up stories of his progress to keep them at bay. The deception was exhausting. He was living a double life, one of authentic connection with Clara and another of hollow performance for his so-called friends. With Clara, he visited the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and she taught him how to see the stories in the brushstrokes of a painting. He took her to a small, family-owned Italian restaurant he hadn't been to in years, a place his mother used to love. He was rediscovering parts of himself he thought were long dead, all while the lie of their beginning festered beneath the surface. He was falling hopelessly in love, and the foundation of that love was a cruel, childish wager. One rainy afternoon, sitting in a small coffee shop, Clara spoke about her past. She told him about growing up with a single mother who worked 2 jobs, about how the violin was her escape, a gift from a grandfather who believed in her talent. She talked about the sting of being underestimated, of being seen as just a pretty girl with a hobby rather than a serious artist. As he listened, Julian felt the weight of his own deception press down on him. He was doing the very thing she despised, reducing her to an object, a prize to be won. The guilt was a physical ache in his chest, a constant, low-grade fever that spiked every time she looked at him with her trusting green eyes. The deadline for the bet was only a week away. The pressure from his circle was becoming unbearable. Marcus cornered him at a business lunch, his smile thin and menacing. "You'd better not be getting cold feet, Julian. A lot of money is riding on this. Don't make us think you've gone soft." The threat was veiled but clear. If he didn't produce the proof of his victory, they would expose the bet to Clara themselves. Julian was trapped. Telling Clara the truth would mean losing her forever, the thought of which was a pain sharper than any business failure he had ever endured. But continuing the lie felt like a betrayal of not only her, but of the new man he was trying to become. In the end, fear won. He made the devastating choice to protect the present by burying the past. He told himself it was an act of love, that he was shielding her from a truth that would only cause her pain. He rationalized that their relationship was real now, and that was all that mattered. He would win the bet, silence his friends, and then he and Clara could build a life together, untroubled by its tainted origins. He decided to host an elegant party at his penthouse, a grand affair where he would officially introduce her to his world. It was a fatal miscalculation, an attempt to merge his 2 lives that would instead set them on a collision course, ensuring that the lie he was so desperate to hide would be exposed in the most public and humiliating way imaginable. The penthouse was a symphony of Julian's success, a carefully orchestrated performance of wealth and influence. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a city that seemed to bow before him, its lights a glittering tribute to his power. He stood with Clara by his side, her simple elegance a quiet counterpoint to the room's loud opulence. For a moment, he believed he had done it. He had merged his two worlds, bringing the one thing of real value into his gilded cage. He watched her speak with one of his colleagues, her genuine curiosity a breath of fresh air in the stale atmosphere of networking. A wave of profound love washed over him, so potent it almost erased the gnawing guilt. He was about to raise a glass, to officially introduce her, to seal their future and bury the past forever. He was convinced the lie was a necessary sacrifice for a beautiful truth. The delicate clinking of glasses and murmur of conversation was abruptly shattered by a single, slurred voice. It was Marcus, his face flushed with champagne and envy. He swayed slightly as he stepped into the center of the room, raising his glass, not in celebration, but as a weapon. "A toast," he announced, his voice dripping with malice, "to our friend Julian. A man who always gets what he wants." He paused, letting the silence stretch, his eyes locking onto Julian's. "He told us a month ago he could make this lovely musician fall hopelessly in love with him. He made a bet, a very big one. And looking at them now, I'd say it's time for us all to pay up. Congratulations, Julian. You won." The words hung in the air, cold and sharp, and the world stopped. Every eye in the room turned to Clara, their gazes a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. A hush fell over the penthouse, so deep and complete that the distant sound of a city siren felt like an intrusion. Everyone waited for the inevitable explosion. The tears, the screams, the slap that would echo across the marble floors. But Clara did none of those things. She stood perfectly still, her face a mask of profound and quiet disappointment. The color drained from her cheeks, but her posture remained unshaken. She slowly turned her gaze from Marcus to Julian, and in her green eyes he saw not the fire of anger he deserved, but the devastating emptiness of a trust that had been utterly annihilated. It was a look of such cutting sadness that it broke him more completely than any shouted accusation ever could. She was not seeing a lover, she was seeing a stranger, a fraud who had played a cruel game with her heart. Then, with a grace that defied the ugliness of the moment, she turned her attention to Marcus and the silent, watching circle of Julian's friends. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it carried across the cavernous room with perfect clarity, each word a precisely aimed arrow. "Congratulations, gentlemen," she said, her tone even and devoid of any tremor. "Julian is truly excellent at everything he does. He won the bet." There was no sarcasm, only a statement of fact delivered with a dignity that shamed every person in the room. Without another word, without a single tear, she turned and walked toward the door. The soft click of the latch closing behind her was the final, deafening sound of Julian's world collapsing. He was left alone, a king in a court of jesters, having won his prize only to discover its cost was his own soul. He didn't register the whispers that erupted around him or the triumphant smirk on Marcus's face. None of it mattered. In the ringing silence of her absence, Julian was confronted with the stark, horrifying truth of who he was. The bet was not a foolish mistake. It was the pinnacle of a life built on conquest and control, a life devoid of genuine connection. Her calm departure was not an act of weakness, but of immense strength. She hadn't needed to humiliate him. His own actions had done that far more effectively. The pain he felt wasn't the sting of public exposure, but the deep, internal agony of losing the only real thing he had ever had. That soul-crushing moment, when you realize you've destroyed your own happiness, is a difficult but often necessary turning point. If you believe in the power of these stories of transformation, subscribing helps us continue to bring them to light. The weeks that followed were a quiet, painful reckoning. The penthouse, once a monument to his success, felt like a mausoleum for a life he no longer wanted. He didn't try to call her or send extravagant apologies, understanding instinctively that such gestures were part of the man she had rightfully rejected. Instead, he began the methodical process of dismantling his empire, He met with lawyers and financiers, not with the predatory zeal of a deal-maker, but with the quiet determination of a man settling a debt with his own soul. He sold his controlling interest in the tech firm he had built from the ground up, a move that sent shockwaves through the financial world, but felt to him like the first clean breath he had taken in years. He was not running from his wealth. He was repurposing it, transforming the currency of his old life into the foundation of a new one. 6 months passed. In that time, the Caldwell Foundation for the Arts was born. It wasn't a vanity project announced in a press release. It was a working organization housed in a modest downtown building, dedicated to providing grants and performance spaces for musicians who, like Clara, possessed immense talent but lacked resources. Only then, when he had something real to show for his transformation, did he seek her out. He found her after a small recital at a local conservatory. He didn't approach with a prepared speech, only with a humility she had never seen in him. He asked for nothing but a moment of her time, not to relitigate the past, but to ask for her forgiveness and to show her what her quiet dignity had inspired him to build. He simply handed her an invitation to the Foundation's inaugural open house, a silent offering of his changed self. When Clara walked into the Foundation's headquarters, she found not a monument to Julian Caldwell, but a vibrant community hub. She saw young musicians practicing in soundproof rooms, their faces alight with the same passion she felt for her own art. She saw a gallery space showcasing the work of unknown painters and a small, perfectly designed concert hall. Julian was there, not as a CEO overseeing an asset, but as an active participant, talking with the artists, listening to their ideas. His eyes no longer bored, but filled with a genuine purpose. He showed her everything, explaining the programs with a quiet pride that had nothing to do with ego. In his actions, she saw the apology he could never properly articulate. She saw a man who had not tried to buy her forgiveness, but had instead earned the right to ask for it by becoming someone worthy of her respect. Their new beginning was not a grand, romantic reunion, but a series of quiet conversations over coffee, walks in the park, and shared evenings listening to the Foundation's young artists. They were starting from scratch, building a relationship brick by brick on a foundation of absolute honesty. He learned to be vulnerable, and she learned to trust again. Julian's wealth was still there, but it was no longer the center of his identity. It was merely a tool to create beauty and opportunity in the world, a purpose she had shown him. Their love story wasn't a fairy tale conquest, but a testament to the difficult, beautiful work of transformation. Stories like this, about finding a second chance not just with someone else but with yourself, are why we do what we do, and subscribing is the simplest way to help us continue sharing them.